On a warm, sunlit afternoon, a peaceful park buzzed with the sounds of children's laughter, their small feet racing around as parents watched with quiet joy. The swings creaked gently, and the faint hum of a merry-go-round blended with the rustling leaves above. It was a scene straight out of a postcard, a perfect day for families to enjoy the fresh air and the simple pleasure of togetherness. But amid this idyllic setting, an unexpected confrontation began to brew, one that would send shockwaves through the community and beyond. Near the edge of the playground, a tall, young police officer leaned casually against the railing. Dressed in his crisp uniform, he appeared to embody authority and respect. Yet, the half-lit cigarette in his hands told a different story. The no smoking sign just a few feet away seemed like an ironic backdrop to his defiance. His casual demeanor and the thin trail of smoke curling into the air didn't go unnoticed. Parents exchanged uneasy glances, some pulling their children closer, but no one dared to speak up. After all, he was a police officer, a figure meant to uphold the law. Across the park, a middle-aged woman walked with purpose yet calmness. Dressed simply in a white shirt and dark jeans, her salt and pepper hair tied neatly back, she blended effortlessly into the crowd. Nothing about her outward appearance suggested she was anything more than a regular visitor enjoying her day off. But there was an air of quiet authority in her stride, a presence that couldn't be ignored. Her name was Elena Davis, a rear admiral in the Navy, though that detail wasn't obvious at first glance. She was here not as an officer, but as a concerned citizen, someone who valued respect and fairness above all else. As Elena neared the playground, the scene before her shifted from tranquil to troubling. Her sharp eyes caught the sight of the smoking officer and the discomfort it was causing. It wasn't just the cigarette, it was the blatant disregard for the rules and the indifference to the community's welfare, especially with children nearby. For Elena, it wasn't just about the smoke or the sign. It was about what it represented. The uniform he wore symbolized responsibility and trust, values she had spent her entire career upholding. To see them undermined in such a casual manner struck a nerve. Elena hesitated for a moment, considering her next move. She was not one to seek confrontation, but she also believed in standing up for what was right. With a deep breath, she approached the officer, her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone measured. "This is a no-smoking area, and there are children around. Could you please put out your cigarette?" The officer turned his head lazily, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the woman before him. He didn't respond immediately, choosing instead to blow out a puff of smoke, almost as if to challenge her. His smirk was dismissive, his body language oozing contempt. "And who are you to tell me what to do?" he finally said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Elena didn't flinch. Her expression remained steady, her voice unwavering. "I'm a citizen who cares about the community and its rules. As a police officer, you should understand the importance of setting an example." The smirk widened, transforming into a laugh that echoed louder than the children's chatter. "You've got some nerve, lady," he said, flicking the ash of his cigarette onto the ground. "Why don't you mind your own business?" Around them, parents and bystanders began to notice the escalating tension. Some murmured quietly, their eyes darting nervously between the two. A few moved further away, shielding their children from the growing scene. But Elena stood her ground, her posture unyielding despite the officer's mocking demeanor. "I'm not here to argue with you," she said, her tone firm but still respectful. "I'm here to remind you of your duty, not just as an officer, but as a member of this community. Smoking here is against the rules, and it's harmful to these children." The officer's smirk faded, replaced by a flash of irritation. He straightened up, stepping closer to Elena. "You don't get to lecture me," he said, his voice growing harsher. "You're just some old woman in jeans. You don't know who you're messing with." Elena's heart quickened, but her expression didn't betray a single ounce of fear. She had faced far greater challenges in her life, and this man's hostility was nothing compared to the pressures of her naval career. "I may not know you," she replied calmly, "but I know what's right, and what you're doing isn't." The tension thickened, drawing the attention of more onlookers. The officer's face twisted with anger, and his next words were laced with venom. "Do you think your words mean anything to me? People like you always think you can tell us what to do." For a moment, the world around them seemed to hold its breath. Elena's gaze remained locked on the officer, her composure unshaken. But before she could respond, the officer's hand moved to his side, and the unmistakable gleam of a gun caught the sunlight. Gasps rippled through the crowd as fear took hold. The laughter of children faded into silence, replaced by the heavy weight of uncertainty. With the gun now pointed directly at her, Elena knew the stakes had risen dramatically. Yet, even in the face of such a grave threat, she refused to waver. Her voice was calm but firm as she spoke, her words carrying the weight of her resolve. "You're making a mistake, one you'll regret for the rest of your life." The officer's grip tightened on the weapon, his face a mask of defiance. Around them, the crowd watched in stunned silence, their collective breath held as the standoff unfolded. And in that moment, the line between right and wrong, courage and cowardice, was about to be drawn in a way no one would forget. The air in the park felt heavy, almost electric. Parents clutched their children tightly, their faces pale with fear. Some whispered hurried prayers under their breath, while others stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or run. The once lively playground had become an unsettling theater, with Elena and the officer at the center of a confrontation that seemed poised to spiral out of control. Elena, however, remained unnervingly calm. Her years of naval service had trained her for high-stakes situations, though nothing about this day had prepared her for the intensity of this moment. She kept her hands visible, making slow, deliberate movements as she carefully slipped her phone from her pocket. Every move was calculated, designed to de-escalate, without backing down. Her eyes never left the officer, her voice steady as she addressed him again. "You don't need to do this," she said softly but firmly. "Put the gun down and let's talk. There's no need for violence." The officer's eyes flickered with uncertainty for the briefest moment, but his expression quickly hardened again. Whether it was fear, arrogance, or some twisted need to assert control, he held his ground. "Don't tell me what I need to do," he snapped. "You think you're so righteous, trying to embarrass me in front of all these people. I'll show you who's in charge." Despite his raised voice and the gun in his hand, Elena sensed his underlying insecurity. She'd seen it before, in recruits struggling to prove themselves, or in officers who cracked under pressure. But this was different. This man's position of authority, coupled with his apparent instability, made him more dangerous than most. She knew she had to tread carefully. Meanwhile, whispers rippled through the crowd. A young mother clutched her toddler close, her voice trembling as she spoke to another parent. "Who is that woman? Why isn't she running like the rest of us?" "She must be someone important," another murmured. "Look at how she's handling him. She's not even flinching." Unbeknownst to most of the onlookers, Elena's calm demeanor came not just from experience, but from a deep sense of duty. For years, she had fought for justice, fairness, and the safety of others. It wasn't just a job, it was a calling. And now, standing face to face with a man who seemed determined to prove his authority through intimidation, that calling felt more urgent than ever. The officer's face contorted with anger as he gestured wildly with the gun. "You don't get it, do you? You think you can waltz in here, tell me what to do, and walk away like nothing happened. People like you always think you're better than everyone else." Elena didn't react to the insult. She refused to let his words distract her from the goal, diffusing the situation without anyone getting hurt. She knew that responding emotionally would only fuel his aggression. Instead, she kept her tone even, her gaze steady. "I'm not here to make this worse for you," she said. "I'm here to remind you of the responsibility you carry when you wear that uniform. You can still make the right choice." But her calm words only seemed to provoke him further. The officer took another step closer, the barrel of the gun trembling slightly in his grip. "You don't know anything about me," he shouted. "You don't know what I've been through, what I deal with every day. Don't stand there acting like you're some kind of hero." For a moment, Elena considered his words. It wasn't the time or place to delve into his personal struggles, But she understood that his anger likely stemmed from more than just this encounter. It was a reminder of how deeply some wounds could run, and how dangerous they could become if left unchecked. The distant sound of a siren cut through the tension like a blade. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding hearts of those watching. But it grew louder with every passing second, signaling that help was on its way. The crowd stirred, their fear mingled with a flicker of hope. Elena's gaze flicked briefly toward the sound before returning to the officer. She noticed the shift in his demeanor, how his shoulders stiffened, how his eyes darted nervously toward the approaching siren. His confidence, which had seemed unshakable moments ago, was beginning to crack. "You hear that?" she said, her voice low but pointed. "Backup is coming. You can end this now peacefully before it gets worse. Or you can keep digging yourself into a hole you won't be able to climb out of." The officer's jaw clenched, his grip tightening on the gun. "I don't need backup," he growled. "I can handle this myself." But Elena could see the fear creeping into his eyes. It was the fear of losing control, of being exposed for what he had done. And as much as he tried to mask it with anger, it was becoming harder for him to hide. The siren grew louder, and soon a patrol car came into view, its flashing lights reflecting off the surrounding trees. The vehicle came to an abrupt stop near the edge of the park, and a tall, commanding figure stepped out. Sheriff Matthews, his crisp uniform as sharp as his demeanor, surveyed the scene with a mix of shock and urgency. He had been briefed on the situation during the drive over, but seeing it unfold in real time was another matter entirely. "Alina," he called out, his voice firm but respectful. "What's going on here?" The officer, who had previously seemed untouchable in his arrogance, now looked like a deer caught in headlights. His bravado evaporated as he realized the gravity of his actions and the consequences they might bring. "I warned him," Elena said, her tone calm, but laced with authority. He didn't listen. Matthews turned his attention to the officer, his expression hardening. "Rick," he said sharply, "put the gun down. Now." For a moment, Rick hesitated, his gaze shifting between Elena and Matthews. His mind raced, weighing his options, but the reality of his situation was sinking in fast. The presence of his superior left no room for further defiance. As the tension reached its peak, the crowd watched with bated breath, unsure of what would happen next. Would Rick comply, or would his desperation drive him to make an irreversible mistake? The park, once filled with laughter and joy, had become the setting for a moment that no one would soon forget. And as Sheriff Matthews took another step closer, his hand resting on his own holstered weapon, the fragile balance of the situation teetered on the edge of chaos. Rick stood motionless, his face pale and his jaw tight, as if locked in an internal battle. The weight of the situation was finally pressing down on him, yet the defiance in his eyes hadn't fully faded. The growing crowd murmured in hushed tones, the tension thick enough to feel like it might snap at any second. Sheriff Matthews kept his voice steady but firm, repeating his demand. "Put it down, Rick. Don't make this worse." Elena stayed rooted where she was, her eyes focused on Rick, but her peripheral vision tracking every movement around her. She wasn't going to leave until she was sure the situation was under control. Still, she felt a pang of unease. Even as Rick hesitated, she couldn't help but think back to how quickly things had escalated. How had it gotten to this point? Why had someone like him been allowed to wear a badge in the first place? The events of the day started replaying in her mind. It had all started so innocently. A visit to the park. A chance to clear her head. She hadn't planned on getting involved in anyone else's business. But as soon as she'd seen Rick, the unmistakable stench of alcohol clinging to him, the unsteady way he moved, she knew something was wrong. Her instinct had kicked in before she even had time to think. Her years in the Navy had taught her to recognize danger before it fully unfolded. It was a survival skill, a sixth sense honed through countless high-pressure situations. She'd seen people like Rick before, men who carried their authority like a weapon, hiding their insecurities behind a veneer of power. But this was different. This wasn't some far-off battlefield. This was a public park, filled with families and children. And Rick wasn't just any man. He was a police officer. As the sheriff stepped closer to Rick, Elena noticed the subtle shift in his demeanor. Rick's hands trembled slightly, his fingers tightening around the gun in a way that sent a chill through her. She knew he was scared, but fear could be just as dangerous as anger. One wrong move, one miscalculated step, and the situation could spiral out of control. "Rick," Matthews said again, his tone more measured but still commanding, "you've got a choice to make here. You can either put that weapon down and talk this out, or you can throw away everything you've worked for. Is this really what you want?" Rick's breathing was heavy, his chest rising and falling with each strained breath. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, his gaze flicked between Elena and the sheriff, his confusion and panic etched across his face. The crowd had grown larger now, their whispers louder as they speculated about what was happening. Some recorded the scene on their phones, their screens glowing faintly in the dimming light. Others looked away, unable to bear the tension. But everyone, even the smallest child, could feel the weight of what was unfolding. Elena's own mind was racing, piecing together what little she knew about Rick. She hadn't recognized him at first, but as the confrontation had dragged on, fragments of memory had started to surface. She remembered hearing his name in passing, maybe even seeing him at a community event. He was known around town, not for anything particularly noteworthy, but for his reputation as someone who could be both charming and temperamental, depending on the day. But this wasn't just a bad day. This was something deeper, something darker. Rick's behavior wasn't just erratic, it was dangerous. And yet, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story. What had pushed him to this breaking point? Was it the stress of the job? Personal struggles he couldn't talk about? Or was it simply a result of years of unchecked power and privilege? As she stood there, her mind flashed back to her own experiences with authority figures who had let their egos overshadow their responsibilities. She thought about the times she had seen her fellow officers struggle, the times she had struggled herself. The pressure to always be strong, to always have the answers. It could break even the toughest among them. And for someone like Rick, who seemed to thrive on control, losing that sense of power could feel like losing everything. Sheriff Matthews, meanwhile, was doing his best to keep the situation under control. He kept his hands visible, his movements slow and deliberate. He knew Rick well enough to understand that pushing him too hard could backfire. But he also knew that time wasn't on their side. The longer Rick held that gun, the more likely it was that something would go wrong. "Rick," he said again, his voice softer this time, "think about what you're doing. This isn't who you are. You're better than this." For a brief moment, Rick's expression shifted. His grip on the gun loosened slightly, and his shoulders slumped as if the weight of Matthew's words was sinking in. But just as quickly, the anger returned. He took a step back, his face twisting in frustration. "You don't know anything about me," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You think you're so perfect, so righteous, but you don't know what it's like. You don't know what I've been through." The outburst hummed in the air, echoing through the now silent park. Matthews didn't flinch, but his expression softened. "Then tell me," he said. "Help me understand." Rick hesitated, his eyes darting around the park, as if searching for an escape. The crowd, the flashing lights, the cameras, it was all too much. He felt cornered, trapped and exposed. And yet, somewhere deep inside, he seemed to realize that there was no way out. Not without help. Elena, who had remained silent until now, decided to speak. Her voice was calm but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Rick, whatever you're dealing with, it's not too late to turn this around. But you have to make the choice. Right here, right now." Rick looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of anger, fear, and something else. Something that almost resembled regret. For a moment, it seemed as though he might listen, that he might finally lower the gun and surrender. But the moment passed, and the tension lingered. The crowd held its collective breath as the standoff continued, the weight of the unresolved conflict pressing down on everyone. Elena could feel the sweat on her palms, the ache in her legs from standing so still for so long. But she refused to move, refused to give up. She knew this wasn't over yet. Rick's breathing grew heavier, his grip tightening on the gun once more as his emotions surged. The crowd seemed to close in, even though no one moved closer. The flashing lights of police cars reflected in his eyes, painting a scene that felt more surreal with every passing second. Sheriff Matthews maintained his calm demeanor, but Elena could see the strain beneath it. This wasn't just about de-escalating a dangerous situation. This was personal. Rick wasn't just another officer in trouble. He was someone Matthews had once trusted. Elena's mind kept circling back to what Rick had said. "You don't know what I've been through." The rawness in his voice suggested something deeper, something more than just a bad decision made in a moment of weakness. She couldn't help but wonder what had driven him to this breaking point. Was it the stress of the job? A personal loss? Or was this the culmination of years of unchecked behavior, finally coming to a head? The sheriff took another cautious step forward, his voice steady. "Rick, you're right. I don't know everything you've been through. But I do know this. Whatever it is, it's not worth throwing your life away. We can figure this out, but you have to trust me." Rick's face twisted with a mix of frustration and despair. He shook his head, his voice rising. "Trust you. Trust you. You have no idea what it's like to carry this weight, to deal with the pressure, the expectations. Everyone's always watching, waiting for you to slip up. And when you do, they turn on you. They don't care about the good you've done. They only see the mistakes." His words hung in the air, resonating with an uncomfortable truth. Elena could see the flicker of recognition on some of the faces in the crowd. Rick wasn't entirely wrong. People were quick to judge, slow to forgive. But his actions today had crossed a line, and he seemed blind to the fact that his pain didn't excuse his recklessness. Elena's gaze shifted to a man standing near the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He looked familiar, and as she studied him, she realized he was wearing a Navy cap. His posture was rigid, his expression unreadable, but there was something about him that suggested he wasn't just a bystander. Elena made a mental note to speak with him later, if there was a later. As the tension dragged on, Elena's own emotions started to bubble to the surface. She couldn't help but think of the young sailors she mentored, the ones who had struggled with the weight of their responsibilities. She thought about the times she had to intervene, to pull someone back from the edge before they made a mistake they couldn't take back. And she thought about the ones she hadn't been able to save, the ones whose pain had been too great to overcome. Rick's voice broke through her thoughts. "You think you're so perfect, Matthews. Sitting there in your nice office, handing out orders while the rest of us are out here, dealing with the real world. You don't know what it's like to have people hate you just because of the badge you wear. You don't know what it's like to have to prove yourself every single day, to feel like no matter what you do, it's never enough." Sheriff Matthews didn't respond right away. He let Rick's words hang in the air, their weight undeniable. When he finally spoke, his tone was measured but firm. "You're right, Rick. I don't know what it's like to be you. But I do know this, right now, you have a chance to make things right. You have a chance to take responsibility for your actions and start over. Don't let your pride stop you from doing the right thing." Elena watched Rick closely, her own thoughts swirling. She couldn't ignore the parallels between Rick's situation and some of the struggles she'd seen in the military. The pressure to perform, the fear of failure, the isolation that came from feeling like you couldn't show weakness. It was all too familiar. But while she could empathize with Rick's pain, she couldn't excuse his actions. He had crossed a line, and there were consequences for that. The man in the Navy cap caught her eye again. This time he was shifting uncomfortably, his gaze darting between Rick and Elena. There was something in his expression, something almost like recognition. Elena's instincts told her there was more to his presence here than met the eye. She took a small step toward him, keeping her movements slow and deliberate so as not to draw too much attention. "Excuse me," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. "Do you know him?" The man hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. Finally, he nodded. Yeah, he said, his voice low. I served with him. A long time ago. Helena felt a pang of surprise. She hadn't expected that. In the Navy. He nodded again, his jaw tight. Rick was one of the best back then. Smart, resourceful, always willing to help a fellow sailor. But something changed. I didn't know what it was, but when he got out, he wasn't the same. Alina's mind raced. This new piece of information added a layer of complexity to the situation. If Rick had served in the military, that could explain some of his behavior, the anger, the paranoia, the sense of being constantly on edge. But it also raised more questions. What had happened to him after he left the service? What had driven him to this point? She turned her attention back to Rick, who was still standing with the gun in his hand, his body tense, and his eyes darting between Matthews and the crowd. There was a flicker of something in his expression, regret, maybe, or fear. Whatever it was, it gave Elena a sliver of hope that this could still end peacefully. But the sheriff's patience was wearing thin, and the tension in the air was becoming almost unbearable. The crowd was restless, the murmurs growing louder as people began to question how long this could go on. Elena knew they were all thinking the same thing, that the longer Rick held that gun, the greater the chance that something terrible would happen. Elena's pulse quickened as she realized the man in the navy cap had stepped closer to her. He leaned in, his voice low and urgent. You need to end this, he said. Rick listens to people he respects. If you can get through to him, maybe he'll put the gun down. Elena felt a surge of pressure. She wasn't sure if she was the right person for this, but she knew she had to try. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, her eyes locked on Rick. The crowd seemed to fade away, the noise and chaos melting into the background as she focused on the man in front of her. Rick, she said, her voice calm but firm, you're not alone in this. Whatever you're going through, we can help. But you have to let us. You have to take that first step. Rick's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the defiance in his expression seemed to waver. But the gun remained in his hand, and the tension lingered. The standoff wasn't over, not yet. The air seemed to grow heavier with every passing second, the tension coiling tighter and tighter like a spring ready to snap. Rick's grip on the gun remained firm, though his fingers trembled slightly. It was a small crack in his otherwise hardened exterior, but it was enough to give Elena hope. The sheriff stayed close, his hands still raised in a show of non-aggression, but the unspoken urgency in his posture made it clear that time was running out. Elena took another cautious step forward, her eyes never leaving Rick's. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the crowd behind her, but she forced herself to stay focused. Rick, she said gently, her voice steady even as her heart raced. I know it feels like the whole world is against you right now. I know it feels like there's no way out of this. But I promise you there is. You just have to trust us. Rick let out a bitter laugh, the sound sharp and hollow. Trust you. Trust them asterisk. He gestured toward the other officers, his voice rising. You think they care about me? You think anyone here actually cares about what happens to me? They just want to see me fall. They want to see me fail so they can feel better about themselves. Elena shook her head, her expression softening. That's not true, Rick. Look around you. People aren't here to see you fail. They're here because they care. Because they want to see you come out of this alive. You've been through so much, and I know it feels like no one understands. But you don't have to go through this alone. For a moment, Rick's eyes flickered with something like doubt. But then his jaw tightened, and he shook his head, his voice filled with anger and pain. You don't get it. You can't. You haven't been where I've been. You don't know what it's like to wake up every day and feel like you're drowning. To feel like no matter what you do, it's never enough. Elena's chest tightened at his words. She could see the raw emotion in his eyes, the pain that he was trying so hard to hide behind his anger. She thought about what the man in the navy cap had said, about how Rick had once been one of the best. Somewhere along the way, he had lost himself, and now he was standing on the edge of a precipice, ready to fall. The sheriff took a small step forward, his voice calm but firm. "Rick, we all had our battles, and I'm not going to pretend I know what you've been through. But I do know this: hurting yourself or someone else isn't the answer. You've got people who care about you, people who want to help you. But you've got to let them." Rick's expression hardened, and he took a step back, his grip on the gun tightening. The movement sent a ripple of fear through the crowd, and Elena could feel the tension spike. She knew they were running out of time. If they didn't get through to him soon, this was going to end in tragedy. Elena glanced over her shoulder and saw the man in the navy cap watching intently, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked like he wanted to step forward, but something was holding him back. She turned back to Rick, her voice soft but insistent. "Rick, who are you doing this for? Who are you trying to prove yourself to? Because I can tell you right now, the people who care about you don't want this. They want you to come back to them. They want you to be okay." Rick's face twisted with emotion, and for a moment it looked like he might lower the gun. But then he shook his head, his voice breaking. "It's too late. I've already ruined everything. There's no coming back from this." Elena felt a surge of desperation. "It's never too late, Rick. You've made mistakes. Everyone has. But mistakes don't define you. What matters is what you do next. And right now, you have a choice. You can let this moment destroy you, or you can let it be the start of something new." The crowd was completely silent now, everyone holding their breath as they watched the scene unfold. Even the officers seemed frozen, their hands hovering over their weapons, but not making a move. The only sound was the faint hum of the police radios and the occasional rustle of movement from the onlookers. Rick's breathing was ragged, his chest rising and falling as he wrestled with his emotions. He looked at Elena, then at Sheriff Matthews, then back at the crowd. His eyes landed on the man in the navy cap, and something seemed to shift in his expression. There was a flicker of recognition, followed by a wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. The man in the cap stepped forward, his voice trembling but resolute. "Rick," he said, his tone heavy with emotion. "It's me. It's Pete. Don't do this, man. Don't throw everything away. You're better than this." Rick's eyes widened, and for a moment he looked like he might break down completely. But then he turned the gun on himself, the barrel shaking as he pressed it to his temple. The crowd gasped, and Elena felt her heart stop. This was it, the moment everything had been building toward. She knew they had only seconds to act, but she also knew that any sudden movement could push Rick over the edge. "Rick, stop," she said, her voice rising with urgency. "This isn't the way. Please put the gun down. We can help you. I promise, we can help you." Rick's eyes darted between Elena and Pete, his face contorted with pain. The gun trembled in his hand, and for a moment it seemed like he might pull the trigger. The world seemed to hold its breath, everyone frozen as they waited to see what would happen next. The air was so thick with tension that it felt like time had stopped entirely. Rick stood there, the gun shaking in his hand, his eyes wild and darting between Elena, Sheriff Matthews, and Pete. The silence was deafening every single person in the crowd, afraid to breathe too loudly, afraid to be the one to break the fragile moment. Elena was about to speak again when a sudden sound broke through the stillness, a voice shouting from the edge of the crowd. "Rick, don't do it. We need you." The voice belonged to a woman, her tone frantic, but filled with raw emotion. The crowd parted, and she pushed her way through, her face pale but determined. It was clear from the way Rick's eyes widened that he recognized her. She was younger, maybe in her early 20s, and her resemblance to Rick was unmistakable. The same piercing eyes, the same angular features. It had to be his daughter. "Emily?" Rick's voice cracked as he said her name, the gun lowering slightly. His tough exterior faltered, as if her presence had peeled away a layer of his defenses. "What are you doing here?" Emily didn't hesitate. She moved closer, her hands trembling, but raised to show she wasn't a threat. "I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Dad, please. You're scaring everyone. You're scaring me. Her voice broke, and tears spilled down her cheeks. This isn't you. You've always been my hero, the one person I could count on no matter what. Please, don't let this be how it ends." Rick's grip on the gun loosened further, and for a moment, it seemed like Emily's words had broken through to him. But then his expression darkened, and he took a step back, his voice filled with anguish. "You don't understand, Emily. You don't know what I've done. I'm not a hero. I'm a failure, and I've let everyone down." Elena could see the fear and heartbreak in Emily's eyes, but she also saw determination. "You're not a failure," Emily said firmly, her voice growing steadier. "You've made mistakes, sure, but who hasn't? That doesn't erase everything you've done for me, for Mom, for everyone who ever believed in you. You're still the man I look up to, the man who taught me how to stand up for what's right." Rick's eyes filled with tears, and his hand began to shake uncontrollably. But before anyone could react, another voice cut through the tense moment. A deep, commanding voice that seemed to come out of nowhere. "Rick, step away from them now. Drop the weapon." Everyone turned to see a man in a suit emerging from a black car that had just pulled up. His demeanor was calm but authoritative, and there was something unsettling about the way he carried himself. He was flanked by two men in tactical gear, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. The man's eyes locked onto Rick with a steely intensity. Elena frowned, confused by the sudden arrival. She glanced at Sheriff Matthews, who looked just as surprised. The man in the suit didn't identify himself, but his presence immediately shifted the atmosphere. It wasn't clear whether he was law enforcement, government, or something else entirely. Whatever the case, his arrival added a new layer of tension to an already volatile situation. Rick froze, his body rigid, as he stared at the man. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking but defiant. "What do you want?" The man took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "I'm here to ensure this ends without anyone getting hurt. But that's up to you, Rick. Put the gun down, and we can talk." The man's calm tone was unnerving, and Lena couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his arrival than he was letting on. She noticed Pete subtly stepping in front of Emily, as if sensing the same unease. Rick, however, seemed more agitated than ever. His eyes darted between the man and the crowd, his breathing growing heavier. "You don't know anything about me," Rick spat, his voice rising. "You don't know what I've been through. Don't act like you care." The man in the suit didn't flinch. "You're right. I haven't known your story. But I do know this. The choices you make right now will define how this ends. Do you want to be remembered as the man who gave up, or as the man who fought to make things right?" Rick hesitated, the gun lowering slightly. But before he could respond, one of the men in tactical gear muttered something into his radio, and Elena caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. She turned just in time to see more officers surrounding the area, their weapons drawn and aimed at Rick. The sight of the guns seemed to snap something inside Rick. His eyes widened, and he raised the gun again. But this time, his movements were more frantic, less controlled. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I'm not going to jail. I won't let you take me." The man in the suit raised a hand, signaling for the officers to hold their fire. "Rick, no one is here to take you anywhere. This doesn't have to end in violence, but you need to put the gun down." Emily stepped forward again, her voice pleading. "Dad, listen to him. Please, for me. I can't lose you." Rick's hands were trembling so badly now that it seemed like he might drop the gun. His eyes were full of anguish, torn between his fear of what was to come and his love for his daughter. But just as it seemed like he might finally surrender, the man in the suit spoke again, his voice calm, but laced with an edge that sent a chill down Lena's spine. "Rick, think carefully. There are people watching right now who want to help you, but there are also people who won't hesitate to act if they think you're a threat. Don't give them reason." Rick's eyes darted to the crowd, then to Emily, then to the armed officers surrounding him. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and for the first time he seemed to realize just how precarious his situation was. But instead of calming him, the realization only seemed to make him more frantic. His breathing quickened, and he took a shaky step back, the gun still raised. Elena's heart pounded as she watched the scene unfold. She knew they were on the verge of a breaking point, and one wrong move could push Rick over the edge. The man in the suit took another step forward, his eyes locked on Rick. "Rick," he said, his tone firm but measured. "This is your last chance. Put the gun down, and we can figure this out together. But if you don't—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the unspoken threat hung heavy in the air. Rick's face twisted with emotion, and for a moment it looked like he might comply. But then, in a sudden, almost instinctive movement, he turned the gun toward the man in the suit, his voice filled with rage and fear. "Stay back," he shouted. "I'm not going down without a fight." The man in the suit didn't flinch, his expression remaining cold and unreadable. But Elena could see the tension in his body, the way his hand hovered near his waist, as if ready to draw a weapon of his own. The crowd gasped, the panic rippling through them like a wave. And then, in the split second that followed, everything seemed to happen at once. The moment Rick pointed the gun toward the man in the suit, time seemed to slow. The crowd collectively held its breath, fear and anticipation freezing everyone in place. Elena instinctively stepped closer to Emily, ready to shield her if things spiraled further. Sheriff Matthews raised his hands higher, his voice loud and commanding, yet trembling with urgency. "Rick, stop. This isn't the way." Rick's eyes darted wildly between the man in the suit and Emily, his hands shaking so badly now that the gun wavered. He looked lost, as if every choice in his life had suddenly converged into this one moment. His breathing was ragged, his expression torn between anger, fear, and overwhelming regret. The man in the suit remained eerily calm, his voice cutting through the chaos like a razor. "Rick, this is your chance to take control of your story. You've already lost so much. Don't lose the people who love you too." Emily stepped forward despite Pete's attempt to hold her back. Tears streaked her face, but her voice was steady and filled with emotion. "Dad, please, look at me. I'm still here. I still love you. We can fix this together, but not if you make this mistake. Put it down. For me, for Mom." Rick's grip on the gun faltered, and his gaze locked onto Emily's tearful face. The raw love and desperation in her voice seemed to penetrate the cloud of anger and despair that had consumed him. He blinked rapidly, his hands trembling even more, and for a moment it looked like he might lower the gun. But then a sudden movement to his left startled him. A tactical officer shifting his position, his weapon adjusting ever so slightly. Rick flinched, the gun swinging back toward the crowd, and a collective gasp rippled through the air. The tension snapped like a taut wire, and everything that followed happened in an instant. A single shot rang out. For a terrifying heartbeat, no one knew where it had come from or who it had hit. Rick staggered backward, his face a mixture of shock and confusion. The gun slipped from his hand, clattering to the ground. He clutched his shoulder, blood seeping through his shirt, and fell to his knees. Emily screamed, rushing toward him, but Pete grabbed her, pulling her back to safety. Elena spun toward the source of the shot and saw one of the tactical officers lowering his weapon, his face grim. "Stand down," the man in the suit barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. The officer froze, his expression conflicted but obedient. Rick groaned, his eyes squeezing shut as pain racked his body. Emily broke free from Pete's grasp and dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she tried to apply pressure to his wound. "Dad, stay with me," she sobbed. "Don't you dare leave me." Rick's eyes fluttered open, and he looked at her with an expression that was equal parts anguish and relief. "Emily, I'm sorry," he choked out, his voice weak, but filled with sincerity. "I wanted to fix everything. I just didn't know how." "You don't have to fix it alone," Emily said through her tears. "I'm here. We'll figure it out together. Just hold on." Paramedics pushed through the crowd, their voices calm but urgent as they assessed Rick's condition and began stabilizing him. Sheriff Matthews let out a shaky breath, his hands still resting on his holstered gun as he surveyed the scene. Elena glanced at the man in the suit, her instincts telling her there was more to him than met the eye. He was on his phone now, speaking quietly but urgently, his demeanor as composed as ever. Something about the way he watched Rick being loaded onto the stretcher sent a chill down her spine. As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle sped away, the crowd began to disperse, murmurs of shock and relief rippling through the air. Sheriff Matthews approached the man in the suit, his expression weary but firm. "Who are you, really?" Matthews asked, his tone low but pointed. "And why did you show up here?" The man offered a faint, enigmatic smile. "Just someone trying to prevent a tragedy," he said simply. "You'll hear from my office soon." Before Matthews could press further, the man turned and walked back to his car, his guards flanking him. The black vehicle disappeared into the night, leaving more questions than answers. Elena stood with Pete and Emily, her mind racing as she tried to process everything that had happened. Emily wiped her tears, her gaze fixed on the road where the ambulance had vanished. "He's going to be okay," Elena said softly, her voice filled with reassurance. "He's hurt, but he's alive. That means there's still a chance to make things right." Emily nodded, though her expression remained clouded with worry. "I just hope he gets the help he needs. He's been carrying so much for so long. I don't know if he even knows how to let go." As the three of them stood there, the gravity of the night setting over them, a sudden thought struck Elena. The man in the suit, his calm, almost cold demeanor, his timing, his refusal to explain himself, it didn't add up. "Do you think he'll be back?" Pete asked, his tone cautious. Elena hesitated before responding. "I don't know," she admitted, "but something tells me this isn't over. Not yet." And as the first rays of dawn began to break over the horizon, painting the town in hues of soft gold and pink, there was a lingering sense that the story was far from finished. Rick's survival was only the beginning of a larger reckoning, one that would test not just him, but everyone involved.